Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, chapter 6, halacha 4, in the Art Scroll on 58b2. This is a two-part shiur. This is part 1 of the shiur. Earlier in chapter 4, halacha 1, in the Mishnah, it's talking about the laws for when a vineyard that has been destroyed in the middle of it, and then you have the surrounding area with the vines remaining. The Mishnah now is going to talk about the same sort of thing. What happens if the middle part of the Aris, which is going to be the trellised vineyard, is going to be destroyed? The part of this vineyard that we're talking about is going to bring up, and most of the body of this shiur is going to be bringing up a discussion about something with additional measurements, and we're going to get into that. So the setbacks are going to be a little bit different on the Aris, and it's not going to be clear for this destroyed Aris for the setbacks if that's going to be just for the Aris, or this is teaching a novelty for all measurements regarding length that the sages are saying. The Vilna Goan is going to be saying that this is going to be not just for the Aris, but is really a hekesh for all measurements for length. Most of the commentators of the Yerushalmi are saying that it's only going to be for the Aris. So far, we've been seeing that the Aris is really like in its own category. It's just a strange thing because it looks like it's going to be a vineyard d'Rabbanan. It looks like the Chiddush here that we have of the Aris, the special law that we have of the Aris according to Bet Hillel, is that these can be 5 vines in a row. And we learned before that that's not going to be the case for Bet Hillel. And there's another way to look at the opinion of Bet Shammai that the Chiddush of the crooked Aris is going to be that, and the novelty of the crooked Aris according to Bet Shammai is that that's going to be a vineyard. And we know that the opinion of Bet Shammai is that a vineyard is only going to be 5 in a row. So again, this wall and this trellis is going to have a lot of complexity because there might be a lot of d'Rabbanan things going on here, and it's unclear. Why is it going to be unclear? Well, because this is going to be up on this wall or this trellised area, and you're going to get real d'oraita Kilayim things that are mixed in here, like what we saw in halacha 3, and also it's going to be coming up in halacha 4, where you're planting under parts that are going to be overhanging, and now the vines are going to spread over that, and that's going to come up again. So the Mishnah starts off saying that the measure for permitting the introduction of foreign seed in a disruption of an Aris is 8 amos plus a slight additional amount. The additional amount, the Gemara is going to say, is going to be a tefach. A tefach is going to be a handbreadth. Now you say, wait a second. We're talking about a setback, and it's not just 8 amos like it was for a regular karam. Now we're talking about adding on a little bit more. That is going to be the big hullabaloo that we're getting into, because all of a sudden this is like a new thing. What are we talking about that we're adding on to it? Now, if you're looking at the old way that we were looking at the karam, where we're talking about 8 amos for a setback, where it's going to connect some of the vines over here and some of the vines over there, then what's going to end up happening is you say, well, wait a second. What if these vines and these vines are going to exactly be 8 amos? Is that going to include it? And we're talking about like whole integers. Are the whole integers are going to be included, or it's going to be excluded? What about if you're making a setback and you're doing a regular setback, and your regular setback is going to be 4 amos? And now, is that fourth exact amma that for that setback, is that integer number, that's a whole number, for the number 4, is that going to be included for that particular part of space? Well, if you're going to be violating it, well, that's going to be a d'oraita violation. We learned that. So could it be that this additional amount is going to be a d'Rabbanan thing? It's really going to be unclear, but still we're going to get into it. So before we define the disruption where you can have this destroyed part of the Aris, the Mishnah is going to get into another comment concerning the uniqueness of this measurement. And it says, and all measures stated by the sages concerning a vineyard do not contain whole numbers plus a slight additional amount, except for the measure with respect to the disruptions of the Aris. So this is saying that, wait a second, maybe this is only going to be for this kind of disrupted Aris, but not other cases of Torah law. But the Vilna Goan is going to actually be erasing the word bekerim in this Mishnah, because he might have had other sources that did not include the word bekerim. And keep in mind that the Yerushalmi has differences between the Bavli Mishnah and there's also going to be some textual variations between the different Mishnahs within the Yerushalmi itself. And it could be that he's looking at this in terms of all areas of Torah law. So the question is this Mishnah going to be talking about only the disruption of the Aris, or is this going to be something talking about all Torah law for length? Now, the Mishnah is going to come define what the disruption of the Aris is. And again, this is going to be like what we saw in Kilayim 4:1, where it's talking about where the vineyard is destroyed in the middle. And the Mishnah says that these are the disruptions of an Aris. It says that the Aris that was destroyed in the middle, and there are 5 vines on one side of the gap and 5 vines on the other side on the other side. And in this case, the law is as follows. Now, how do we read this, right? We know that a vineyard or the Aris is going to be 5 vines. And you originally had, say, 11 vines here. You had 5 on the left wall and 5 on the southernmost wall. And you had 1 in the middle, which would be at the corner. And this one, for whatever reason, was destroyed. And the Mishnah says that the law in this case is as follows. And it says that if there is a gap of 8 amos between the 2 sets of 5 vines that are left there, he may not introduce foreign seed there. Now, as we're going to see in this Gemara, foreign seed may not be planted there, even in the gap, if this gap is going to be larger than 8 amos, as long as it does not measure 8 amos and a tefach. Now, again, that's where this tefach comes in, because you can't do at the whole number. That's the point, right? You can do, if you do it at 8 amos, like what we were learning before, that's going to be a problem. You need to add the extra tefach in order to do this. Mishnah continues and says, if, however, the gap is 8 amos plus a slight additional amount, again, that's going to be a tefach, we give it its work area and he may plant the remainder. In other words, the space is at least 8 amos plus 1 tefach, and then the stringency concerning the disruption of the Aris does not apply, and we're going to consider the remaining 10 vines as 2 vineyards. And then when we were before, it was 11 vines, and we took one out in the middle, and now it's just going to be 2 vineyards. It's going to be 5 and 5. But before, it was just 1 vineyard. So this gets similar to what Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was talking about, and what we were talking about with Rabbi Yossi before in chapter 6, Halacha 1, where he's going to be talking about planting between 2 sets of vines after distancing just 6 tefachim from each set. Each Aris now is going to be independent of each other, and planting is going to be permitted between them after you're going to distance between this vineyard and that vineyard just 6 tefachim on each side. That's going to be the explanation by the Vilna Goan in this. You can see that more in your Deya 296-81. But accordingly, with this disruption of the Aris, if you're going to start a new field, you're going to have to set back from the vines, 8 amos and a tefach, so that definitely each are going to be independent of each other. So you really have 2 sets of setbacks. The Aris is just granted the 4 amma work area only opposite, and the sides are going to be granted only 6 tefachim. Now, that's going to be a chiddush, and that's a hint that there's a lot of d'Rabbanan things going on in here. Now, a normal vineyard, the setbacks are going to be 4 amos on all sides if that's a halachic vineyard. But we're not seeing the 4 amma setbacks on the sides of the vines next to the wall. We're only seeing a 6 tefach setback. If the space is going to be at least 8 amos in a tefach, then where are we putting that? And then we're saying that you are measuring between the set of vines on this 5 and the set of vines on that 5. Between the 5th vine and the now 6th vine, you have to have 8 amos and 1 tefach. In other words, there has to be 4 amos at the edge of this quote-unquote vineyard, and there has to be 4 amos at the edge of that quote-unquote vineyard, and a single tefach as well. But what's interesting is that, if you wanted to start planting foreign seed, that you can look at just a 6 tefachim setback from the edges of it. In other words, if you're looking at the outer edge, then you can just do a setback of 6 tefachim. But if you're looking at now the area between, again, combining between, this Aris and that Aris, that's going to be 8 amos and a tefach. The Mishnah says that, if there is a gap of 8 amos between the 2 sets of vines that are left there, he may not introduce foreign seed there. And if, however, the gap is 8 amos plus a slight amount, again, that's going to be the tefach, we give it the work area and he can plant the remainder. So, again, we're talking about a destroyed Aris, and what are we going to do in between? Now, we knew that in chapter 4, halacha 1, there was going to be strictnesses that Bet Shammai put into place and actually added 50% of the area required in order to plant within there. And, perhaps there's going to be a similar kind of penalty going on over here, not necessarily by Bet Shammai, but that the sages are going to be saying that, because the rules are so hard to understand for the Aris and complicated, that we have to be extra strict for the planting of the middle part between this destroyed Aris. Now, again, perhaps you were talking about having a lot of vines and a few in the middle died or were destroyed. What do you do? Because you've now split this up into 2 different vineyards. The Mishnah is going to say that an Aris that emerges from a wall from within a corner and ends, we give it its 6 tefach work area and he can plant the remainder. Now, what is going to be going on over here? And so, in other words, you have the Aris, it begins at the corner and it ends at the middle of the wall, and it doesn't continue along the rest of the wall. And Rabbi Kanievsky in his Beur is describing the case like this, that there are vines that are trained onto 2 walls to form a right angle, and the 2 vines are trained onto the wall, and 3 vines are going to be trained onto the other wall, and it forms an L shape. The Mishnah is going to continue and basically be having this idea that distancing, 6 tefachim from the vines trained on the 2 walls, that you can have foreign seed planted along the rest of the empty wall. It's going to continue. Rabbi Yossi says that if there are not 4 amos there, he may not introduce foreign seed there. Rabbi Yossi is going to be lenient on here. He's going to be holding that if the remainder of the wall measures less than 4 amos, then that is subordinate to the vines. And it's going to be considered the domain of the vines in which planting foreign seed is prohibited, even if, by the way, you are going to plant 6 tefachim from the actual vines. So the idea is that this gets into this principle of subordination that we learned in chapter 6, halacha 3, that what happens if you have a trellis and these vines are climbing on top of the trellis, and now, or, by the way, you have a barren tree, and, it's only started to climb onto the barren tree, and, now, basically the vines are going to be the primary thing, and the tree is going to be subordinate to the vines. And what this is saying is that what Rabbi Yossi is basically saying is that if you have this wall and there's not going to be 4 amos with the rest of this wall or the rest of this trellis, then you can't introduce foreign seed there, because eventually these vines are going to overtake the rest of the wall, and you're going to end up to a deraita Kilayim problem, because your setbacks, these vines might go over part of the seed, and you might have part of the seed now being underneath part of the vine that's climbing on this wall or trellis. And then really what his point is, and it's not necessarily a contradiction with what we learned, but a nuance that adds to this idea that, hey, now you have a wall, the remaining part of this wall is less than 4 amma, and you have vines growing on this thing, and basically now the vines are primary and this wall is going to be subordinate to the vines. And so basically he's holding that this is very much like the barren tree in chapter 6 halacha 3, and that we are going to say that the wall would be primary if the wall was going to be more than 4 amos long. Then we wouldn't need to worry about this. We can go back to the 6 tefach setback on the side of this second vine without any problem. And again, now that if you have a wall that's going to be longer than 4 amos, now this is going to be looking like the fruit-bearing tree, where you have some vines on some of the tree, but the fruit-bearing tree is going to be primary, and the vines are going to be subordinate. And that would be the same case with this wall. If it is going to be larger than 4 amos with what's left on, holding this Aris, then, your setback, is not going to be 6 tefachim. It's only going to be forbidden because, eventually these vines are going to spread over to it. It might go over it. And again, the vines are going to be primary. The wall is going to be subordinate. But if it is going to be longer, then the wall will be primary. Now, regarding the reeds that are used to make the trellis itself, and before we were thinking about walls, and yes, vines do grow on walls, and they have these tendrils that can grab onto little cracks. And now what about a trellis? And how did they make them? They made them out of reeds. So concerning reeds that extended from the trellis, although he values them and he does not want to cut them off, it is nevertheless permitted to introduce foreign seed opposite them, in other words, beneath these reeds. Now, what's going on here? The Rambam explains that if he is going to cut the reeds too short, then he's worried that trimming them is going to cause the lattice that is made of these woven reeds to fall apart. And you can find this in the commentary by the Rambam in Hilchos Kilayim 6:14. When you're training on a vine and you're putting this onto the lattice frame that you constructed with these crisscrossing reeds, we don't trim the reeds that are going to protrude from the frame because you don't want to destroy the lattice. And the worry is that it's held together with this crisscrossing pattern, and if you start trimming that off, you end up where the thing just starts to come apart. And so the idea is that what's going to be subordinate, what's going to be primary, again, it comes right back to that. So the point is that these extensions now are going to be primary because you don't want to devalue your lattice work and have this trellis fall apart. Again, you're valuing the trellis. So you're going to be saying that I want these extensions there, and you're not viewing this as part of something that is going to be subordinate to the vine. You're going to be saying that that's primary to the vine because, in fact, even if the vine might grow there, you don't necessarily want to have the vine there. You don't necessarily want to cut it back. And so, again, the primary thing that you're desiring is to hold together the lattice. And you're not just doing it where it's going to be an eventual support for the vine. That's going to be the idea. So basically, you're intending these protruding reeds as future supports. And, if you're doing it in that case, now you're going to have another issue. So in other words, if you're saying, well, these extending reeds are now, I'm hoping that the vines are going to grow onto these, that's going to be another issue. And now that's going to be the issue in the Mishnah. So it says, if he made them, in other words, he left them long and untrimmed, in order for the new growth to extend over them, then it is forbidden to introduce foreign seed beneath it. What are you valuing here? What's going to be primary and what's going to be subordinate? In the first part, you're valuing the structure itself, and you don't want to trim it so it falls apart. In the second case, you're saying, I hope that it grows onto the extended parts, and I don't have a problem with it. And if that's going to be the case, now the vine is going to be primary, and those extended parts are going to be subordinate, and now you're not going to be able to plant underneath it. So We talked before about planting under a vine branch before, and now we're going to be talking about one vine branch. So it says that if a shoot of one of the grapevines of the Aris is going to protrude beyond a trellis and it's going to extend beyond the Aris's prohibited area, and that's what happens with vines. Sometimes they're going to go very, very long, and maybe the tip of the growing branch is going to be extending over it. And the work area of the Aris can either be 4 amos or 6 tefachim. And what if this is now going longer? So the Mishnah says that we view it as though a plumb line were hanging from the protruding root. In other words, we're going to put like a line coming down with a cord and a metal weight that suspends, and it's used by builders to determine whether the wall is straight. And in other words, says Pnei Moshe, we're using an imaginary plumb line to determine the area that's directly below the shoot. And it says that we view it as though there's a plumb line that was hanging below the protruding shoot, and it is forbidden to introduce foreign seed opposite, in other words, beneath it, underneath where that is, and it is forbidden to introduce foreign seed opposite, and so too with respect to a single raised vine. What's going to be a raised vine? In other words, this is going to be a shoot that's protruding beyond the 6 tefach work area of a single vine elevated on a pole. And the Mara Fulda says that the area directly beneath the protruding shoot, as delineated by this imaginary plumb line, is forbidden for planting, and also the surrounding area, which is not directly beneath the shoot, may be planted with foreign seed. It also continues and says, so too with respect to a single raised vine, that if one stretches a vine branch from one tree to another, it is forbidden to introduce foreign seed directly beneath the vine branch. So in this case, you're now trying to connect this vine to a new tree and to grow on top of it. And now so you're connecting from maybe a trellis to a tree or another wall, and basically underneath this vine that's now connected from one support to another support, like a rope connecting two walls, basically you can't plant underneath it. That's what this is saying. Now we finish up the Mishnah, and it says, if the vine branch was not long enough and he extended it with a rope or reed grass, in other words, he tied a rope to the end of the vine branch to lengthen it so it can reach this second tree, it is permitted to introduce foreign seed beneath the extension. If, however, he made the extension so that the new growth should extend over it, it is forbidden to introduce foreign seed beneath the extension. In other words, if it's not intended to support future growth, then planting underneath it is allowed. But if it's intended to support future growth, it's forbidden to plant underneath it. That's where we're going with this. So the Gemara is going to talk about the disruptions of the Aris, and we're going to get into what about this 8 amos and a bit, because it provokes a big problem. Is this going to be a generality like a hekesh relating to all types of measurements, or is this just particular to the Aris? And ultimately, the answer is going to go unanswered. But meanwhile, here's how the Gemara goes back and forth. So again, we're talking about the 8 amos plus the slight amount. And again, this is talking about what happens if the middle part of the Aris is destroyed, and now we want to introduce foreign seed between the two remaining parts in the middle. The Gemara says, does this Mishnah not argue with Rabbi Zera? Because an earlier Mishnah ruled that 2 rows that are 8 amos apart do not combine with each other to constitute a 2-row vineyard. And this, by the way, is in chapter 4, Halacha 6. So in explaining that ruling, Rabbi Zera said that the 8 amma distance necessary to separate between 2 rows is exclusive of the place occupied by the trunks of the vines. So the Mara Fulda says when looking at the distance between the 2 rows, the area of the vine trunks themselves are not taken into account. In the same way, he's basically maintaining that the minimum 4 amma distance between the vines of a vineyard is exclusive of the place occupied by the trunks of the vines. And according to this Mishnah, in the first case with the 11 vines that were making up this original 11-vine Aris vineyard, that it must have been separated from one another by 4 amma of empty space. And consequently, when the middle vine is going to be destroyed, and now you have two groups of 5, the gap in between the two sets of vines is going to be more than 8 amos. So how is it more than 8 amos? Because what's the remaining part? The remaining part is going to be a tefach, which is going to be the width of the trunk. So in other words, we're looking at a normal vineyard. A normal vineyard, you're going to plant vines 4 amos from one another. Well, this is talking about Rabbi Zera's case, saying, well, maybe they're planting 4 amos from one another. They have 11 vines here. The 11th vine, or the one in the middle, the former 6th vine is going to be destroyed. You now have 2 vineyards, 5 and 5. And what's going to be the width of the trunk? It's going to be a tefach. So now you have 4 amos between each of these vines. So you have on the side of the new vineyard and the side of the other vineyard, you have 4 amos, 4 amos, and what's in the middle? One tefach. That's going to be one way to read it. So the question is, how does this Mishnah differentiate the case between where the gap is going to be 8 amos and the case where the gap is going to be 8 amos plus the tefach? The Gemara is going to answer. It says when this Mishnah is saying that if there's a gap of 8 amos, it says interpret it as meaning that there's a gap of 8 amos and a bit more, again, a tefach. So in the same way that the Mishnah states explicitly that planting is permitted where the gap is 8 amos plus a slight amount, why didn't the Mishnah just state that planting is forbidden when the gap is 8 amos plus a bit more, and then, plus the width of the uprooted vine? And in other words, you're saying, well, what's the width of the vine? It's going to be a tefach wide. Fine. So why doesn't it just say it's 8 amos plus the destroyed vine's width? Why isn't it going to be more precise? And the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, do you not hold that which Rabbi Yochanan said, which concerning any measure stated by the sages that is a whole number plus a slight amount, that additional amount refers to a tefach. So he does agree with that. So it's emerging that the disruption of the Aris may not be planted unless it measures 8 amos plus a tefach. And according to this, addition of a bit more that can be added, that's going to be to account for the space of the vine that is missing. We are talking now about the trunk. And so you have, again, 4 amos, you have 4 amos plus the missing trunk, and this is going to be there. But why didn't the Mishnah write it this way? The size of a disruption of the Aris may not be planted is going to be less than a tefach, and therefore the Tana doesn't state it. In other words, since, as the Marafulda explains about this, in the case where planting is forbidden, the additional measure over 8 amos, if it's going to be less than a tefach, they did not bother with a minuscule amount, they just rounded it up. And Rabbi Yonah is going to ask a question, and this question now really gets into the guts of this. And really the idea is, he wants to know, why is it that our Mishnah is going to limit its statement to measures only concerning the Aris? And if this is going to be now an idea that we're talking about a whole number plus a slight additional amount, maybe that's going to be unique just to the Aris, or maybe that's going to be related to other areas of Torah law. That's what he wants to know. And we want to know that too. Is this going to be a thing with length in general, or only with this case? So his question reads like this: why then do we not simply say in this Mishnah, all the measures stated by the sages do not contain whole numbers plus a slight additional amount, except for the measure with respect to the disruptions of the Aris? Or why isn't it read in other Mishnahs? What about these extra amounts? So in looking at this Mishnah and comparing it with other Mishnahs, why don't the other Mishnahs now talk about the additional amount that could be there? Why aren't the other Mishnahs talking about the disruption of the Aris? And so what do we do with this one Mishnah that we have now? How do we read it? Rabbi Yonah's question is going to basically, presuppose that there's no other measure given by the sages throughout any area of Torah law that contains a whole number plus a slight amount. And the Gemara is going to question that, but this is not going to be in length. This is just going to be in weights. And so we learned in a Mishnah elsewhere in Menachos, that, by the way, is going to be in 78a, that the floor from which the 20 Naziris loaves were made will measure 10 Jerusalem kavin, and then it's going to say that they are equivalent to 6 isserons plus an additional 2/3 of an isseron. So this Mishnah is correct in limiting its statement to measures concerning the vineyard, but in other areas of Torah law, there are measures that do have whole numbers plus slight additional amounts. What about that with regard to Rabbi Yonah's question? But again, that's going to be with weights, and this is going to be with length. The Gemara defends Rabbi Yonah's question. It says there, the Mishnah in Menachos is dealing with measures of volume, whereas our Mishnah is referring to Amos, which are going to be measures of length. And Rabbi Yonah is correct in presuming that with respect to length, there's no other measure given by the sages throughout any other area of Torah law that contains a whole number plus a slight additional amount. And again, that's why he's asking, why doesn't the Mishnah make a general statement, either here or in other Mishnahs, throughout either all areas of law, or that this is just going to be an exemption for the disruption of the Aris? And again, what are we doing with this? Because it's very cryptic and unclear, and we're not sure how to deal with this. Is this going to be a hekesh that deals with all other areas of length in Torah law, or is this only dealing with a disruption? And why isn't this Mishnah or the other Mishnahs dealing with length mentioning either case and saying, well, the whole numbers, that's going to be the way it is, or that there is a slight additional amount and that's going to apply for all other areas of law? Or why doesn't it also say that it's going to be the whole amount except for the disruption of the Aris? And we don't get that anywhere. So the Gemara is going to challenge Rabbi Yonah's premise from another Mishnah. This, by the way, is going to be from in Trumos in 4.7 and Trumos in 4.6 as well. It says, we learned in a Mishnah concerning the nullification of Truma. Again, this is going to be with size. Okay, it's not necessarily going to be with length. And we know that things are nullified in 101. So if you have like 99 parts and one part fell in, is it nullified? No. If you have 100 parts and one part fell in, is it nullified? Yes. That, by the way, is going to be a deraita thing that's inferred from a reading in the Torah and the way the dikduk is put together that you can find in the beginning of Trumos. But the Gemara says like this, that Rabbi Yossi ben Meshulam says that the plus a slight additional amount does have a minimal measure. In other words, it's going to be a kav plus 100 seah and a sixth of the quantity of the truma that's going to forbid the mixture. This Mishnah is correct in limiting the statement to measures concerning the vineyard. But in other cases of Torah law, there are measures that do contain some whole numbers plus a slight additional amount. And again, that's going to be on sizing and nullification. That's not necessarily going to be on length. And the Gemara, again, is going to point out what Rabbi Yonah's point is. And it's going to say that there, the Mishnah is talking about the measures of volume. But here, our Mishnah is talking about amos, which is length. And again, Rabbi Yonah is correct in saying that with regards to length, there's no other measure given by the sages throughout any other area of Torah law that contains whole numbers plus a slight additional amount. And so, again, what you saw over here in Truma, that you're saying, well, if you're having 99 equal parts of chulin plus a little bit more, so there's a complete mixture of 100 parts plus a little bit more, then, that's going to be enough to nullify it. So if you have a sa'ah of truma and it becomes nullified in a composite mixture of 100 sa'ah plus a slight additional amount, then that's going to be enough to work. And that's why they're talking about different quantities of volume. And it makes it work, right? When you convert it out, it works out. But over here, this one's not talking about volume, and the other one's not talking about weights. We're talking here about length. And the Gemara is going to defend it, and then we're going to finish up. But we learned in another Mishnah in Eruvin 2.5, it's going to challenge it again, that Rabbi Yudah ben Bava says that one may carry on the Shabbos in a garden or a karpaf, and that's going to be an enclosure, by the way, that's going to have a 10 tefach high fence. And, it says that that's going to be 70 amos and a fraction by 70 amos and a fraction. So over there in Eruvin, 2.5 in the Bavli here, that's going to be in 23a, that's basically limiting the area to areas larger than 5,000 square amos. But the point here is that now we're talking about a fraction again. So isn't that going to be a contradiction? And now that, when you look at this, this does look like a case where there's another area of Torah law where it now talks about length and it's talking about amos, and it has a whole number plus a slight additional amount. So now, what would Rabbi Yonah's question be about that to defend it? And he gets a defense actually by Shmuel, which is a nice guy to have defend your position. And Shmuel says that the extra fraction there in Eruvin was taught in the Mishnah. It's going to be 2/3 of the Amma. And this slight additional amount in our Mishnah, however, as explained by Rabbi Yochanan, is a tefach. So Rabbi Yonah is correctly arguing, says the Shmuel, that all length measures stated by the sages throughout all areas of Torah law do not contain whole numbers plus a slight additional amount measurement, like for a tefach, with the exception of the measure of the disruption of the Aris. And the Gemara leaves Rabbi Yonah's question unanswered. Now, in part 2 this year, we're going to get into the points of the disruption of the Aris and the setbacks. But real quick, according to the Rosh Cirilio, the Gemara is citing Shmuel, not in defense of Rabbi Yonah's question, but to define the fraction mentioned by Rabbi Yudah ben Bava. And in that opinion, the Gemara has successfully rejected Rabbi Yonah's question by citing this statement by Eruvin, where we do see that with respect to measures of length, there is an area of Torah law that contains whole numbers plus a slight additional amount. And according to the Rosh Cirilio, the Mishnah's comment addresses any fraction that's minimally a tefach. So maybe Rabbi Yonah's point still is applicable. So again, it doesn't, we're talking about over there in Eruvin something that's 2/3 of an amma, which again is pretty big. Now you're talking about something here which is much more minuscule. We're talking about something that's a tefach, which is much, much smaller. And the Vilna Goan doesn't read any of this like this at all. He's basically saying that, this Mishnah is commenting that, with the occurrence of measures that are not a whole number, that this is going to be applied to all areas of Torah law. And basically, Rabbi Yonah, according to the Vilna Goan in his Beur, is wondering how the Mishnah can make such a comment. Again, he's deleting bekerim in the Mishnah, so that this is now not just talking about an Aris or a kerem, this is more of a generality. And so the Vilna Goan is looking at Rabbi Yonah's question to say, why do we say that this measure is unique concerning all areas of Torah law? And why do we not say in the Mishnah that this measure is unique concerning all areas of Torah law? In other words, he's basically reading this to say that, this does apply to other areas of Torah law as well. He's basically saying that the whole integer is going to be where you need a slight amount more to make length things work. And according to the Vilna Goan, Rabbi Yonah is basically, questioning Eruvin, where, the Gemara answers that there's a 2/3 Amma area, and this Mishnah is talking about a tefach, and basically he's pointing out that in these cases, with regards to length, there is a bit that is a little bit more. The question is, what's going to be the halacha l'maisa? I do not think it follows the Vilna Goan, but it is interesting that there are textual variations in this. Have a great day.